U.S. history isn't just presidents, wars, and serious speeches. Sometimes, it's a dog on trial, a pig almost starting a war, or lawmakers confidently arguing with math. And yes, every single one of those actually happened. These aren't conspiracy theories. They're not internet jokes. They're moments from real American history where things got a little weird. Not because people were bad or stupid, but because history is made by humans. And humans experiment, they overthink, they panic. They double down on ideas that sound great for about 5 minutes. Looking back, it's funny. At the time, it was serious business. So if you enjoy history at its most surprising, unexpected, and occasionally hilarious, you're in the right place. Here are 45 real moments from US history that prove even the past had its "wait, what?" moments. Fact 1. When the US once tried to tax beards. In the mid-1800s, several US cities seriously debated taxing beards, not as a joke, as policy. At the time, beards were seen as symbols of political views, rebellion, or questionable morality. Lawmakers argued that if hats and property could be taxed, facial hair should qualify too. Some proposals even suggested higher taxes for larger or more decorative beards. The logic was simple and very official. If you choose to grow it, you can afford to pay for it. Public reaction was mixed. Some men shaved in protest. Others doubled down out of spite. Enforcement proved awkward, subjective, and impossible to standardize. Eventually, the idea quietly disappeared. Not because it was unconstitutional, but because no one could agree how to measure a beard without starting another argument. Fact 2. The time Christmas was officially banned in America. In the 1600s, celebrating Christmas was illegal in parts of colonial America, especially in Puritan-controlled Massachusetts. Leaders believed Christmas encouraged excess, laziness, and behavior they considered unproductive. Instead of joy, the day was supposed to be treated like any other workday. People caught celebrating could be fined. Shops were expected to stay open. Decorations were frowned upon. The irony? The ban made Christmas far more tempting. Quiet celebrations continued behind closed doors. Enforcement became inconsistent and uncomfortable. Over time, attitudes softened, laws changed, and Christmas returned, stronger than before. The ban didn't erase the holiday. It accidentally proved how deeply people wanted it. History later reframed the moment not as cruelty, but as an early lesson in how hard it is to legislate joy out of existence. Fact 3. When America declared war on alcohol and lost. In 1920, the United States officially banned alcohol nationwide through prohibition. The goal was simple: reduce crime, improve health, and strengthen families. On paper, it looked responsible. In reality, it created an entire underground economy almost overnight. Speakeasies multiplied, bootlegging thrived, organized crime found a perfect business model. Instead of disappearing, alcohol became more exciting. Enforcement overwhelmed police. Public respect for the law dropped. After 13 chaotic years, the government reversed course and repealed prohibition. It remains one of the few times the U.S. formally admitted, in writing, that a nationwide experiment didn't work. The lesson wasn't about alcohol. It was about unintended consequences when reality ignores good intentions. Fact 4. The law that accidentally made it illegal to save drowning people. In the 1800s, certain local laws around water safety were so poorly written that they unintentionally discouraged rescue attempts. Some regulations focused heavily on property rights and liability, creating fear that helping someone could result in legal trouble. As a result, bystanders sometimes hesitated, not out of cruelty, but confusion. Lawmakers later clarified and corrected these rules, but the damage was already done to public trust. The situation highlighted a recurring historical theme. Laws written to solve one problem can accidentally create another. Today's Good Samaritan laws exist largely because earlier versions proved how dangerous ambiguity can be when quick human action matters most. Fact 5. When Congress argued for hours about what counts as a vegetable. In 1893, the U.S. Supreme Court heard a case that required defining whether a tomato was a fruit or a vegetable. Botanically, it's a fruit. Legally, it mattered for tariffs. After extensive argument, the court ruled tomatoes were vegetables because that's how people use them in everyday life. The decision wasn't about science, it was about practicality. This ruling still stands today. It didn't change biology, but it did change taxes. The case is now remembered less for the outcome and more for the reminder that sometimes law chooses common sense over textbooks and does so very formally. Fact 6. The year the government seriously regulated ice cubes. In the early 1900s, as refrigeration became more common, local governments began regulating ice. Yes, actual ice. Ice was harvested, sold, delivered, and used in food preservation, which made it a public health concern. Officials debated sizes, purity, storage methods, and even how ice should be handled during delivery. Meetings were held, reports were written, standards were drafted. The intention was safety, but the result was a surprising amount of bureaucracy around frozen water. Inspectors checked ice houses, companies filed paperwork, consumers complained about inconsistent cubes. Eventually, modern refrigeration made most of these rules irrelevant. The episode is remembered as a reminder that when new technology appears, regulation often arrives before anyone fully understands what actually needs regulating. Fact 7. When a dog was officially put on trial in America. In the 1800s, U.S. courts occasionally treated animals as legal defendants. One famous case involved a dog accused of attacking livestock. Instead of informal punishment, the incident escalated into a formal, legal proceeding. Witnesses testified. Arguments were made. The dog was represented, indirectly, by its owner. The court wasn't joking. At the time, animals were often considered extensions of property, which placed them oddly inside the legal system. While the practice didn't last, it highlighted how early courts struggled to adapt law to real-life situations. Today, the case is remembered not as cruelty, but as an example of how seriously the legal system once took everything, even when common sense might have suggested a simpler solution. Fact 8. The court case that turned a tomato into a legal problem. In the late 19th century, importing vegetables meant paying tariffs. Importing fruit often didn't. When tomatoes entered the debate, importers argued they were fruits based on botany. The government argued they were vegetables based on usage. The disagreement went all the way to the Supreme Court. After hearing arguments, the court ruled tomatoes were vegetables, not because of science, but because of how people cooked and ate them. The ruling still affects trade law today. It's remembered as one of the most polite arguments in history over something found in a salad. The case proved that sometimes the law prefers dinner tables over textbooks. Fact 9. When a man sued himself and won. In the 1990s, an American man legally sued himself after causing a car accident. The twist? He was insured, and the lawsuit was required to trigger his insurance payout. Technically, he was both the plaintiff and the defendant. The court allowed it. The case moved forward. The insurer paid. While it sounds absurd, it was perfectly legal. The case exposed how insurance systems prioritize procedure over logic. No one laughed in the courtroom, but history certainly did later. It remains a favorite example of how systems built for fairness sometimes create situations that feel like legal riddles rather than real life. Fact 10. The trial that had to decide if pants were indecent. In the early 20th century, some U.S. cities debated whether women wearing pants in public violated decency laws. Yes, pants. Police issued warnings. Courts heard arguments. Officials worried that clothing choices might disrupt social order. Over time, public opinion shifted faster than the laws did. What once required debate eventually became normal without fanfare. The episode is remembered less for the restriction and more for how quickly culture moved past it. History didn't judge the moment harshly, it simply laughed gently and moved on, reminding us that today's controversy often becomes tomorrow's non-issue. Fact 11. When the Supreme Court had to define what is obscene. In 1964, the U.S. Supreme Court faced a case that forced them to define obscenity. The problem? No one could agree on a definition. After lengthy discussion, Justice Potter Stewart famously admitted he couldn't clearly define it, but added, "I know it when I see it." That sentence became legal history. It wasn't meant as a joke. It was an honest attempt to describe something deeply subjective in legal terms. The ruling acknowledged a truth lawmakers rarely admit. Some concepts resist precise definitions. The decision didn't simplify future cases, but it did humanize the court. Today, it's remembered as a moment when even the highest legal authority had to admit that common sense sometimes stands in for perfect language. Fact 12. The case that proved common sense isn't a legal requirement. In multiple early American court cases, judges were forced to rule on situations that seemed obvious to everyday people, but complicated on paper. One famous example involved whether standing in a doorway counted as being inside or outside for legal purposes. Arguments stretched on, precedents were cited, diagrams were drawn. The ruling clarified the law, but confused nearly everyone else. The case became a quiet reminder that legal systems are designed for consistency, not simplicity. While frustrating in the moment, these rulings helped shape clearer language later. History remembers them as proof that law often learns by tripping over its own wording. Fact 13. When the U.S. government lost track of an entire department. In the 19th century, the U.S. government restructured so frequently that entire offices were moved, renamed, or absorbed into others. At one point, records showed overlapping responsibilities with no clear ownership. Documents sat unanswered because no one was sure who was in charge anymore. The issue wasn't incompetence, it was growth happening faster than organization. Committees were formed to solve the confusion. Reports were written about reports. Eventually, responsibilities were reassigned and the problem faded. The episode is remembered as an early lesson in bureaucracy. When systems grow quickly, clarity usually arrives later. Fact 14. The time Congress accidentally gave itself a pay raise, twice. In the 19th century, Congress passed legislation increasing salaries for federal officials, including themselves. Public backlash was immediate. The outrage was so strong that Congress repealed the raise, only to later implement similar increases through different mechanisms. The situation created a cycle of approval, protest, and revision. Lawmakers weren't hiding anything. The votes were public. The confusion came from how pay structures were written. Today, the episode is remembered as a lesson in transparency and public trust. It also proved that even well-documented decisions can surprise people when they're not clearly communicated. Fact 15. When a typo changed federal policy. In early American history, laws were written, copied, and distributed by hand. Occasionally, small errors slipped through. In at least one documented case, a minor wording mistake altered how a regulation was interpreted for years. Officials followed the text exactly as written, not as intended. Only later did reviews uncover the discrepancy. Corrections were made, but not before confusion had already shaped policy decisions. The incident became a quiet reminder that precision matters, especially when words carry legal weight. Long before autocorrect, history learned that even tiny mistakes can travel very far. Fact 16. The government program that solved nothing but cost millions. In the early 20th century, several U.S. government programs were launched with confident goals and generous budgets, only to quietly disappear after producing little measurable impact. One well-documented initiative spent years collecting data, commissioning reports, and holding hearings, yet never implemented a single lasting solution. The program wasn't corrupt or secretive, it was simply stuck in analysis mode. Committees debated, subcommittees refined language, funding continued, results didn't. Eventually, the program was folded into another department and its work summarized in a final report few people read. History remembers it less as a failure and more as an early example of how bureaucracy can confuse motion with progress. Activity looked impressive, outcomes stayed theoretical. Fact 17. When officials spent years studying something obvious. At various points in U.S. history, federal and state agencies commissioned long studies to answer questions most people already felt they knew. One famous example involved years of research, surveys, and expert testimony to confirm a basic, everyday observation. The study was thorough. The conclusion matched public intuition almost perfectly. No one disputed the findings. because no one had doubted them in the first place. The report wasn't mocked at the time, it was praised for rigor. Today, it's remembered affectionately as a reminder that institutions value certainty, even when the answer feels obvious. Sometimes, history shows us that proving the simple can be surprisingly expensive. Fact 18. The meeting that could have been an email. In 1890. Long before email existed, Americans still held meetings that history would later describe as unnecessary. In the late 19th century, government committees gathered repeatedly to discuss issues with clear outcomes that everyone already agreed on. Records show multiple sessions, detailed minutes, and formal votes, all confirming the same conclusion. The process wasn't inefficient by the standards of the time, it was simply thorough. Looking back, it feels familiar. Even without modern technology, institutions preferred collective confirmation over quick decisions. The episode reminds us that meeting culture didn't begin with offices. It's been part of organized decision-making for centuries. Fact 19. When doctors recommended cigarettes for health. In the early 20th century, American doctors occasionally recommended cigarettes to relieve stress, soothe throats, or aid digestion. Advertisements featured medical endorsements. The advice reflected the science of the time, not deception. Research linking smoking to serious health risks hadn't yet emerged. As evidence accumulated, recommendations changed. The earlier advice didn't disappear, it became a lesson. Today, the episode is remembered not as foolishness, but as a snapshot of how medical understanding evolves. What feels obvious now wasn't obvious then. History uses moments like this to remind us that certainty often arrives after experience, not before. Fact 20. The medical treatment that was basically, just bleed a little. For centuries, bloodletting was a common medical practice in America, inherited from European traditions. Doctors believed removing blood could restore balance and cure illness. The method was used carefully and confidently. Patients expected it. Over time, scientific advances showed that bloodletting often weakened patients instead of helping them. The practice faded as medicine improved. Looking back, it feels strange, but it made sense within the knowledge of the era. History remembers bloodletting not as cruelty, but as a reminder that medicine improves by learning what doesn't work first. Fact 21. When doctors thought ice cream caused insanity. In the late 1800s, some American doctors genuinely believed that eating ice cream could damage the brain. The concern wasn't about sugar or calories, it was temperature. Cold foods, they argued, shocked the nervous system and could lead to mental instability, especially in children. Medical journals warned parents to limit frozen desserts. Hospitals even restricted ice cream for patients. The logic sounded scientific at the time. The body likes balance, and extreme cold must disrupt it. As refrigeration improved and research advanced, the theory quietly melted away. Ice cream survived. The brain did too. Today, the idea feels funny, but it captures a moment when medicine was still learning where caution ended and imagination began. Fact 22. The time doctors prescribed whiskey. For much of early American history, whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was medicine. Doctors prescribed it for pain, anxiety, digestion, and even heart problems. Pharmacies stocked it, prescriptions were written. During Prohibition, medical whiskey remained legal, leading to a spike in patients who suddenly needed treatment. Physicians weren't being sneaky. Alcohol genuinely had limited medicinal value before modern painkillers existed. As pharmaceutical science advanced, whiskey prescriptions declined. What's remembered today isn't the treatment itself, but how seamlessly medicine and everyday life once blended. The line between cure and comfort was thinner than we imagine. Fact 23. When science basically said, let's try this and see. Early American science embraced experimentation, sometimes enthusiastically. Researchers tested ideas directly, often without long-term studies or formal safeguards. New treatments, devices, and theories were introduced with confidence and curiosity. Some worked, many didn't. Failures were recorded, discussed, and quietly set aside. This trial and error approach helped build modern standards, but also produced moments that feel reckless in hindsight. At the time, it was progress. Today, those experiments are remembered as stepping stones rather than mistakes. History shows that knowledge often advances by first proving what doesn't work. Fact 24. The health advice that accidentally made things worse. Throughout U.S. history, well-intentioned health advice sometimes produced the opposite effect. Certain diets, routines, or remedies were promoted enthusiastically, only to be revised later. The advice wasn't malicious, it was based on limited data. As understanding improved, recommendations changed. What's amusing now is how confidently earlier guidance was delivered. Pamphlets, lectures, and public campaigns reinforced it. When corrections arrived, they were often quiet. The episode reminds us that health advice evolves. What feels certain today may become tomorrow's footnote. Fact 25. The war that started because of a pig. In 1859, a dispute between the United States and Britain escalated over a pig. An American farmer shot a British-owned pig that wandered onto his land. What followed were diplomatic protests, troop deployments, and months of tension on the US-Canada border. No shots were fired beyond the pig. Eventually, cooler heads prevailed, and the matter was resolved peacefully. The incident became known as the Pig War. It's remembered fondly as a reminder that international conflicts don't always begin with grand ideology. Sometimes they start with livestock and poor communication. Fact 26. When the military built something nobody could use. At several points in U.S. history, military engineers built equipment that looked impressive on paper, but struggled in real conditions. One well-documented example involved vehicles and gear designed with ideal scenarios in mind: flat terrain, perfect weather, cooperative physics. Once deployed, reality intervened. Mud, hills, and human limitations made the equipment awkward or impractical. Reports followed, revisions were suggested, new committees evaluated what went wrong. The designs weren't foolish, they were optimistic. History remembers these projects as lessons in how planning can overlook everyday realities. It wasn't failure, it was field testing on a national scale. Fact 27. The battle plan that was literally lost during the American Civil War. A Union battle plan was accidentally lost, physically. The document fell into Confederate hands after being wrapped around cigars. The opposing side suddenly had access to detailed troop movements. Historians later called it one of the most famous intelligence mishaps in U.S. history. What makes it memorable isn't the mistake itself, but how ordinary it was. Paper was paper. Mistakes happened. The incident became a reminder that even the most carefully planned strategies can unravel because of simple human error. And sometimes, history turns on something as small as misplaced paperwork. Fact 28. When the Army ordered the wrong thing in massive quantities. In multiple historical moments, the U.S. military placed large orders for supplies that turned out to be poorly matched to actual needs. Uniforms arrived in the wrong size range. Equipment didn't fit the climate. Tools were impractical in the field. None of this came from negligence. It came from scale. Supplying thousands of people quickly requires assumptions, and assumptions sometimes miss the mark. Warehouses filled with unused items. Adjustments followed. History remembers these moments not as embarrassment, but as proof that logistics is one of the hardest parts of any large operation. Fact 29. The weapon that scared everyone, including its own side. Some experimental weapons in U.S. history were so new that even the people deploying them weren't entirely comfortable. Early demonstrations startled observers and operators alike. The technology worked, but unpredictably. Training manuals were updated, safety rules expanded. Eventually, better designs replaced the originals. These moments are remembered as growing pains rather than disasters. Innovation often arrives loud, surprising, and a little intimidating, even to its creators. Fact 30. When strategy sounded smart until reality showed up. Throughout U.S. military history, strategies that looked flawless in planning rooms sometimes faltered once implemented. Maps simplified terrain. Timelines ignored fatigue. Assumptions met resistance. The result wasn't catastrophe, it was adjustment. Commanders adapted, plans changed, and lessons were learned. These moments stand out because they show how decision-making improves through experience. History doesn't mock these plans. It smiles at the reminder that reality is always the final reviewer. Fact 31. The time America printed money that didn't really work. In the early years of the United States, paper money was still a bold experiment. Different states issued their own notes, often without strong backing. Some bills lost value almost as soon as they were printed. Others weren't accepted outside local areas. Merchants argued. Travelers complained. Governments promised fixes. The money wasn't fake, it was just inconvenient. Eventually, the chaos pushed the country toward a more centralized currency system. Today, those early bills are collector's items, remembered as proof that even money needs practice before it feels reliable. Fact 32. When a financial decision wiped out an entire industry. In the 19th century, rapid technological change made certain industries obsolete almost overnight. One famous example involved transportation businesses that thrived until a faster, cheaper alternative appeared. Investments vanished, jobs shifted. The decision to modernize made sense, but the speed shocked everyone. History remembers the moment as a reminder that progress doesn't always wait for people to catch up. Sometimes it sprints. Fact 33. The economic plan that backfired immediately. Several U.S. economic policies were designed to encourage specific behaviors: spending, saving, investing. Occasionally, people responded in the opposite way. Incentives were misunderstood. Loopholes appeared. Outcomes surprised lawmakers. The plans weren't bad ideas. They were incomplete predictions of human behavior. Adjustments followed. Economists took notes. The episodes are remembered as early lessons in how complex, large-scale decision-making really is. Fact 34. When the government accidentally encouraged the opposite behavior. In more than one historical case, regulations meant to limit something ended up increasing it. Restrictions sparked creativity. Bans created demand. Enforcement became a game. None of this was planned. Policymakers reacted, revised, and learned. History now treats these moments as classic examples of unintended consequences, proof that people are excellent at finding workarounds. Fact 35. The investment idea that looked brilliant on paper. Throughout U.S. history, investments backed by strong logic and confident projections sometimes failed spectacularly. Forecasts missed key variables. Public enthusiasm outpaced reality. When results arrived, they didn't match expectations. Losses followed, lessons remained. These moments are remembered not with ridicule, but with appreciation for how optimism fuels innovation, even when it overshoots. Fact 36. The bubble everyone saw coming and still rode anyway. In the late 1920s, across the United States, ordinary Americans rushed into the stock market with extraordinary confidence. Bankers, shop owners, factory workers, everyone believed prices could only go up. Newspapers warned of speculation. Economists raised concerns. The warnings were politely ignored. Buying stocks on borrowed money became normal. At dinner tables, people compared tips instead of recipes. When the market finally collapsed in 1929, the shock wasn't that it happened. It was how many people said they never expected it. Savings vanished. Banks failed. Jobs disappeared. The optimism that fueled the boom made the crash worse. History remembers this not as ignorance, but as collective overconfidence. Everyone saw the edge. Too many decided to jump anyway. Fact 37. When schools taught something that was completely wrong. For decades, American classrooms confidently taught scientific ideas that later turned out to be incorrect. One famous example involved astronomy and geography concepts presented as settled fact. Teachers followed textbooks. Students memorized answers. Exams reinforced them. Only later did research catch up and rewrite the explanation entirely. The awkward part wasn't the correction, it was how long the old idea stayed in circulation. Generations learned the same mistake. When updates finally arrived, teachers had to explain why yesterday's truth no longer applied. The situation wasn't embarrassing, it was human. Knowledge evolves slower than textbooks, and education systems are often the last to catch the update. Fact 38. The lesson plan that confused generations. In the early 20th century, American schools embraced simplified rules to help students remember complex subjects. The intention was clarity. The result was confusion that lasted decades. Mnemonics and shortcuts replaced nuance. Students remembered the rule but forgot the context. Over time, the simplified version became the only version people knew. When educators tried to correct it later, resistance appeared, because everyone had grown up believing the shortcut was the truth. The original lesson wasn't wrong, it was incomplete. History remembers this as a reminder that teaching something easy can sometimes make it harder to fix later. Fact 39. When students were punished for the strangest reasons. In 19th century America, school discipline rules could be extremely specific. Students were punished for posture, facial expressions, handwriting style, or even speaking without the correct tone. Teachers believed strict order created moral citizens. Records showed children disciplined not for misbehavior, but for failing to meet idealized standards of behavior. The intention wasn't cruelty, it was control. Over time, educational philosophy shifted toward flexibility and understanding. Looking back, the rules feel excessive. At the time, they felt responsible. History remembers these moments as proof that even education experiments before it improves. Fact 40. The rule that made school life harder for no reason. In several U.S. school systems during the late 1800s and early 1900s, administrators enforced rigid rules about seating, movement, and daily schedules. Students sat in assigned positions for hours. Standing or shifting was discouraged. Breaks were rare. The belief was that discipline improved learning. Instead, fatigue increased and attention dropped. Teachers reported struggling to keep students engaged. Eventually, reforms introduced flexibility, short breaks, movement, varied activities. The old rules faded quietly. History remembers them as well-intentioned ideas that misunderstood human limits. Structure helps. Too much of it breaks focus instead. Fact 41. The educational reform nobody actually wanted. In the early 1900s, education boards in several U.S. states pushed a sweeping reform meant to standardize learning nationwide. The idea sounded modern. Same curriculum, same pace, same expectations for every student. In practice, classrooms struggled. Rural schools couldn't keep up. Urban schools felt constrained. Teachers reported falling behind because the schedule ignored local realities. Students were labeled slow, not because they were, but because the system refused to bend. Dropout rates rose quietly. Eventually, exceptions were added, then more exceptions, until the reform barely resembled its original vision. The damage wasn't dramatic, it was cumulative. History remembers this as a reminder that efficiency looks great on paper, but learning happens in real rooms with real people. Fact 42. The famous historical fact that's completely false. For generations, Americans confidently repeated a historical fact that never actually happened. It appeared in textbooks, trivia books, and classrooms. Teachers taught it. Students memorized it. The problem? No primary source supported it. Historians later traced the claim back to a single, misinterpreted document that snowballed into accepted truth. When corrections emerged, resistance followed, not from evidence, but from familiarity. People didn't want the fact gone. They liked it. The myth lingered long after being disproven. History didn't record a scandal. It recorded inertia. Once a story becomes comfortable, removing it can be harder than proving it wrong. Fact 43. The quote everyone knows that was never said. One of the most famous quotes attributed to an American historical figure never came from that person at all. The wording appeared decades later, crafted by biographers who wanted a cleaner summary of complex ideas. The quote spread because it sounded right. It fit the image. Speeches, posters, and textbooks repeated it. Only later did historians confirm the original writings contained nothing close to it. The real statements were longer, messier, and less inspiring. The fake quote survived because it was easier to remember. History didn't choose accuracy. It chose convenience. Fact 44. The event people remember completely backwards. A major moment in U.S. history is widely remembered for the wrong reason. Popular retellings flipped cause and effect, simplifying a complex sequence into a neat moral lesson. Movies reinforced it, schools echoed it. The real timeline tells a different story, one where decisions happened out of order and motivations weren't as clean. When historians pointed this out, reactions were mixed. The truth wasn't dramatic enough. The myth stayed because it felt better. History didn't lie, storytelling did. And once the wrong version settled in, it proved surprisingly difficult to evict. Fact 45. The history myth that absolutely refuses to die. Despite decades of research, one American history myth refuses to disappear. Every few years, it resurfaces in articles, speeches, and classrooms. Historians debunk it repeatedly. Sources are clear, the evidence is overwhelming, and still, it survives. Why? Because it's simple, it's catchy, and it flatters the way people like to understand the past. The myth doesn't insult intelligence, it exploits habit. History shows that facts don't spread on accuracy alone. They spread on repetition. And once a myth learns that trick, it's very hard to kill. None of these moments were meant to be legendary. They weren't disasters. They weren't villains or villains in training. They were normal decisions made by real people, officials, teachers, doctors, lawmakers, working with the information they had at the time. Some ideas sounded logical, some felt responsible, some were approved with confidence and good intentions. And then reality stepped in. Rules went too far. Shortcuts lasted too long. Myths outlived the facts that disproved them. What makes these moments memorable isn't how dumb they look now. It's how reasonable they felt back then. History doesn't laugh at them. It gently reminds us, progress isn't a straight line. It's a collection of experiments, some successful, some awkward, and some that make future generations ask, wait, that actually happened? History isn't a record of perfection. It's a record of attempts. Some worked. Some needed revision. Some quietly taught lessons the hard way. What makes these moments fascinating isn't the mistake, it's the confidence behind it. The belief that this time, the plan made sense. And that's why they matter. Because every generation looks back and laughs a little, while doing the same thing in a new way. History doesn't exist to embarrass the past. It exists to show us how learning actually happens, through trial, error, adjustment, and the occasional awkward chapter. So the next time something today feels obvious, permanent, or perfectly planned, remember, the future is already preparing a list.